All right, well, I'm going to respond to a few clips here of when Kyle Kulinski was recently on Joe Rogan's podcast. Some of these things have been mentioned before, but if he keeps mentioning them, I have to keep responding to them.
And Joe raised
You
nine.
are so Bernie happy. Look at you.
Well, I love politics. I love talking about politics and explaining everything.
I know you do, but you're so Bernie happy.
Well, yeah, because Joe, he's an amazing candidate who's just trying to get the U.S. to have social democracy, and he's a guy who I know, because his record shows it, he's going to fight for all of us. Even if you don't agree with him, and even if you dislike him, I understand that. You might be somebody who's right-leaning, he's too far left for you. But what everybody has to say, and they know it's true, is that he's incredibly honest, and he's actually going to fight for you every step of the way.
Yes.
All right, well, social democracy, I seem to remember a countless number of times, in fact, Bernie Sanders stating he was and advocates for democratic socialism, which is essentially simply socialism with a nice-sounding, comforting word in front of it. That word being democratic, of course. So Kyle Kulinski should have the spine to say the word. It's not a dirty word anymore, isn't it? You see, you may hear Sanders speak and think to yourself that sounds great. I won't have to worry about this, that, or that other thing ever again. Bernie's going to swoop in and have the federal government take care of everything for me. That's what you hear. What I hear, and I think the overall history of state interventions proves me correct on this, I hear just another politician overpromising and offering an impossible utopia that requires loaded weapons being pointed at innocent people, by the way. I just hear another politician who is either ignorant or skittish about the fact that whenever governments get involved, they cause unintended and undesirable consequences, as noble as their initial ideas may have sounded. I also hear yet another politician who thinks a one-size-fits-all solution for hundreds of millions of people across 4 million square miles won't run into any serious roadblocks. I also hear a politician that seems to be threatening that if I ever create a business that provides a product or service to society which benefits them, and God forbid I become enriched at the same time, which harms no one as the economy is not a zero-sum game, well then, under the program of Bernie Sanders, I must necessarily become a target of the government for wealth extraction, as according to him, I must be an exploiter or condemning people to some form of wage slavery. But no, it's just a social democracy, guys, nothing to criticize there.
No, I think you're right. And talking to him, he's a very sincere guy. And I think a lot of his policies I agree with. I really, really agree with this whole the exoneration of student loan debt. That to me is a giant factor in a lot of poor decision making that a lot of young people make because they're fucked, because they have this massive debt hanging over their head. It's a huge source of stress, and I think it's a rigged system. I think it's dirty. It's a dirty system.
Yeah.
The Medicare for All, I think, is a wonderful idea.
Oh, Joe Rogan, how far you've fallen. Now, I understand Rogan changes his stance depending on who he talks to. That much is pretty obvious. He can be with Dave Smith, for example, that libertarian comedian, and Joe Rogan can come off as going all in on libertarianism, saying, wow, it just makes so much sense. Yes, government is violence at its core. More people should think of it that way. Or if you remember back in 2012 when Joe Rogan was all in on Ron Paul. In fact, he went on Jay Leno's show wearing a Ron Paul shirt, and he was on the show with Ron Paul. During that period, Joe Rogan was incessantly critical about the gigantic, overburdening nature of government and the massive distortions they're responsible for. But give it a couple years, and now Joe Rogan is all in on a massive increase of government authority within the student loan and healthcare industry, which, by the way, these problems were caused by government in the first place. I mean, they've nearly completely taken over student loans, for example, and they give them out like candy with no regard to risk. You want to go to college for art history? Here's 50 grand, have a ball. Now, Joe Rogan is right. It's a rigged, dirty system, but it's rigged and dirty because of government, and Joe Rogan advocates for basically screwing over people who actually made good decisions by either going to trade school or just starting their own business with no college required, or people who only went to college because they had a specific career goal in mind, which college would actually benefit them in, right? You want to be a doctor, or you want to be an electrical engineer, or if you want to be a particle physicist working at the Large Hadron Collider, college is probably the path for you. Now, this may sound harsh, but if you want to be an art teacher, that's fine, but we should be blaming the government for distorting and manipulating the credit and loan market such that the person who wants to teach art can all too easily go into debt for $50,000 because the government has created a situation in which risk is completely cast aside and everyone just gets whatever the hell they want. That is the root of the problem, Joe Rogan, and having government take it over even further, while, as I mentioned, screwing over those modestly living people who made good decisions, well, that's not a road I think we should go down.
Well, that's like authoritarian communism.
Yes, yes.
But that's I don't agree with that at all.
I don't either.
And people who I talk to who are my friends on the left, they don't agree with that at all. And one of the things that we get most annoyed with is when there's like a conflation. People will look at the former Soviet Union.
Yeah.
People will look at Venezuela. People will look at Cuba. And they'll go, hey, well, that's what you want. And that's what they say to us. And whenever we respond, no, man, we're talking about social democracy.
So, wow, Kulinski actually used Venezuela, Cuba, and the former Soviet Union as an example of what he doesn't support, while at the same time going all in with Bernie Sanders. Now, the three places that immediately come to mind when I think about the places Bernie Sanders has had glowing things to say about is Venezuela, Cuba, and the Soviet Union. Throughout his tenure in Congress, those are the places he had heaped praises upon. Venezuela, of course, he said the American dream is more likely to be found there than here. Cuba, he praised them for having free education, free healthcare, jobs programs, and the Soviet Union, there's that 3.5-hour tape of him hanging out with his comrades in the Soviet Union on his honeymoon, saying glowing things about the Soviet Union. So Kyle Kulinski, those were the three worst examples you could have given in terms of what you don't want when you're in the middle of a discussion about what you do want and how Bernie Sanders is going to give it to you. And by the way, you and Bernie Sanders at this point in time have to criticize and distance yourself from Venezuela, Cuba, and the Soviet Union because they used the exact same propaganda you do, and we are painfully aware of the insanity and chaos they descended into. And I've gone over this before. It's an important thing to know about all those places. They all promised the exact same things you are promising now. That was their entire point. Free education, free healthcare, jobs for all, taking a chunk out of those who are more well off than you. That was the modus operandi of certainly Castro and Chavez. You read their speeches and read their political platforms. You can find them on the internet quite easily. They read almost exactly like a Bernie Sanders speech. Now, does that mean that if Sanders becomes president, the next day people would be shipped off to gulags? No, of course not. Anyone who thinks that is going overboard. But I think it's very fair to point out that Sanders is arguing fervently for an astronomical increase in the authority of government, authority being the root of authoritarianism. We'd be going down that road, and I don't take it lightly from someone like Bernie Sanders, who praised those places even at a time when he should have known better, and it was obvious that serious violations of natural rights were occurring there in the name of those noble pursuits. And then he scratches his head and wonders why they implode. So Kulinski, the reason why you're sick and tired of people mentioning Venezuela, Cuba, and Soviet Union to you is because the dude who you seem to love constantly praised those places. It's really that simple.
We're talking about what they have in Scandinavia. There's usually no substantive rebuttal to that.
Right.
Other than to say, and what's funny, Joe, is they will take credit for those systems in some ways. So it depends. If you talk to Ben Shapiro on one day, he might say, no, Joe, those systems are so good because they're capitalist to an extent. Okay? And then if I fire back at Ben and I go, okay, Ben, then let's implement that style of capitalism, he'll switch it and say, no, they're socialists, so we can't do that.
All right, I talked about this the other day, but speaking specifically to what Kulinski just said about Ben Shapiro, Ben Shapiro, by the way, is someone who I disagree with on a number of things, but what Kulinski said here about Shapiro and free marketers in general is an absurd straw man. And I realize this video is going on long, so I'll try and keep it short. I was actually just watching an older clip of Ben Shapiro just a couple days ago, and in it, Shapiro plainly says what I actually pointed out the other day. Scandinavian countries are generally very capitalistic when it comes to property rights, international trade, open markets, and the freedom of labor. But here's the real clincher that I stated a few days ago, and it's also what Shapiro had pointed out. We pay for their defense. The U.S. taxpayer both directly and indirectly pays for a substantial chunk of not just Scandinavian countries, but Europe as a whole. We pay for their defense. If you don't think that has a significant impact on their ability to pay for their welfare apparatus, then you should stop talking politics completely, go back to the drawing board, and think things through a bit more. If the U.S. did the right thing and got out of these militaristic entanglements, then the already high taxation in Scandinavia would soon become unbearable for them in order to pay for everything. If they decide to pay for their defense, their own defense, to get back to where they were when the U.S. was expending resources on it, then they wouldn't be able to do it. There's absolutely no way they'd be able to do it. So Kulinski asks, why can't we just do what the Nordic model does? Well, that's why. We don't have a global superpower footing the bill for us anywhere. Well, why not just cut our defense budget then? I'm all for that. I'm completely in favor of that. I've said it many times. But unfortunately, even if you cut it to zero, that's about $700 billion a year. That still wouldn't cover it. That would not cover Medicare for all. We've got over 325 million people, whereas Norway has a bit over half the population of just New York City. Centrally planning an economy for that significantly smaller population will still fail, but you may be able to just hold out a little bit longer than if you have a population of almost 35% of a billion people like the US has. And if you have a lot of capitalistic aspects to your economy, as Scandinavian countries do, you might be able to also hold out a little bit longer. The only true sustainable economies are free and open. Losses aren't socialized, and profits mainly come from helping your fellow human. And if your profit comes from screwing people over, it'll be short-lived. Someone will come in, undercut you, and do better, barring the government hasn't set up barriers to entry into the marketplace, as government does in the US all too often. So that's it for now. It's just another clip of Kyle Kulinski strawmanning the hell out of people who advocate for free markets. And it's absolutely ridiculous. And as I said, it's very sad that people take this guy seriously and take what he says as gospel. It's just unfortunate. But that's got to be it for now. Like, subscribe, share, and take it easy.